We are at 63rd and Western, and this is the building where the draft boards, 32 draft boards covering the whole south side of Chicago, were located here. And we rented an office in the building as a bookstore, and this is where we got into the draft board offices and removed a lot of the material, mountains of files and cards, and burned them outside. We did not endanger the building, or much less endanger the life of anybody in there or anywhere around here. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Bishop Tom Gumbleton, and we're at this very interesting spot here, which we have chosen because with the Ambassador Bridge in the background, it symbolizes, in a certain sense, the many young people, young men who fled to Canada, probably many of them across this bridge, to get away from being drafted in the Vietnam War. Many of them did not want to go for various reasons, but one being for reasons of conscience. And so we're here at this spot right by Detroit, which you can see in the background. So Tom, thanks for giving this interview, and I wonder if you could just say something about what was your take. I know you were involved in the peace movement against the war in Vietnam. What was your take on it, basically? How did you analyze it, or what was your objection?
I wasn't very much opposed to the war until just about 1969, when it escalated quite a bit, and I was asked by the Chancellor of the Archdiocese, under whom I worked, to talk with some of the young priests who were protesting, and it was something new, and we weren't used to having priests getting arrested, doing civil disobedience. And so I went to meet with a group of priests and discuss the whole issue. And when I left that meeting, I was convinced they were right.
You were convinced that they convinced
and,
you.
Yes, okay. And I began to enter into the anti-war movement myself. And later on did some civil disobedience because I was totally persuaded that this war was unjust, it was evil, and it would be sinful to participate in any way, even supporting it as a citizen. And so I supported those who did the civil disobedience at that point, and later on did civil disobedience on my own at a number of occasions. So I totally understand why the Chicago 15 did the action they did to try to bring public attention to how evil the Vietnam War was, how wrong it was to participate in it or to support it. And so I admire those people who did that civil disobedience and paid the price for it.
Now, what kinds of things were those priests saying, giving their reasons that they convinced you? And by the way, was Father Tom Lumpkin part of that group? I know he was very committed early on to the anti-war movement.
Yes, he was part of the group, and he himself had done a long fast in protest of the war, 40 days on liquids only, and became a public symbol of anti-war protest because he stood in public places with signs indicating why he was fasting. So he was part of the group that inspired me, and I more and more became committed to opposing the war.
Did you see it in terms of the principles of the just war doctrine, the
yes,
tradition of
at
just
that
war
point,
of the church?
yes, it was. My judgment was made on the basis of just war theology. At that point, I still had not examined the morality of it from the point of view of nonviolence, and that came along later. But it was easy enough in 1969 to recognize that the conditions for a war being justified in Catholic moral theology simply were not present in regard to the Vietnam War. And so based on that theology, I understood this war to be evil and that I had to oppose it.
So our people were in this building, and at one point at about 5 a.m. they broke into the draft board offices and started gathering up all the files, and then at one point they started coming down this fire escape with all the files. I was waiting out here in the car, and I had the gasoline which we used to douse the draft material and set it on fire.
Do not consider our action as an attack on any of you personally. We mean no harm to any of you. We act to save lives and harm no one. After your anger has subsided, please reconsider what we have done. All of us are human beings, trying to live our lives as fully as possible. To us, this meant action. We're not sure what it means to you. We would like to know. We had to act, trying to end the murder of men in Vietnam and the rest of the world. 35,000 men is 35,000 too many. We act with peace and love, try to understand, and we will try to understand also. We will learn and grow together here. We are brothers and sisters. Our unity is real.
And so you mentioned that I know you were in some demonstrations, but you mentioned also in your public statements and teaching against the war, but were some, maybe you could describe a little of that.
Well, I protested at Army bases, and later on, even more often, I protested at places where there was nuclear arms development, the Nevada test site, and or the Strategic Air Command in Omaha. And in those protests, it was usually a matter of crossing a line of some sort. And once you did that, you were in violation of federal law and would be arrested immediately and have to appear in court. And I usually pled guilty, and so never went to trial. And most of the time it was a fine that was imposed. But by protesting and doing it publicly, I and the others who did it even more often than I did, and more dramatically many times, were raising their voices against an evil that had to be opposed, and that we were trying to persuade other people that we could not support a war where the majority of the people being killed were civilians, a war where chemicals were used to destroy the land as well as the people, a war where the troops themselves became, as Pope John Paul said about those in war, it throws their lives into upheaval. And that's because they have to learn to kill, and learn to hate, and they come back traumatized many times. And so there are many reasons why the war was wrong and could not be justified. To make sure somehow I got that message out through my words, through my actions, my writings, and tried to join in the opposition that eventually did bring about the end of the Vietnam War.
The draft boards located here covered the whole south side of Chicago, and so the people who were registered here were members of minority groups, especially blacks and Hispanics, who were inducted and served in Vietnam in very disproportionate numbers. So part of our reason for choosing this particular set of draft boards was to dramatize that. Let me ask you just a very basic question, Tom, which I think still is very necessary. How would you explain the responsibility of Christians to be involved in peace and justice efforts, that is dealing with social structures and policy issues? Many people still don't know what that has to do with the gospel or with Christian charity or love.
Well, I think one of the most basic Catholic teaching documents that make it clear why we have to be involved in action for justice and trying to overcome systemic evil was a synod that took place in 1971, called by Pope St. Paul VI, who at that synod the bishops came to the conclusion that action for justice and participation in the transformation of the world, that is, trying to transform our world into as close an image of the reign of God as possible, that those two things are constitutive dimensions in the preaching of the gospel. In other words, the bishops are telling us there's no such thing as preaching or living the gospel unless you're doing action for justice and participating in transforming this world in which we live into the reign of God. That synod of 1971, when the Vietnam War was still going on, and many other injustices were going on throughout the world, it was a very important turning point in my own understanding of what it meant to be a follower of Christ. And that if you're not doing those two things, action for justice and working to transform our world, you're simply not following Jesus faithfully. And so I think that's a challenge to every one of us. Every Christian, I think, has to face that challenge and decide how I will respond.
very shortly, the Chicago police arrived and took us away to police station and then to Cook County Jail, where we spent a few days before we were bailed out. We were first charged with burglary and arson by the state of Illinois, and then by the federal government with 4 counts in an indictment, including destruction of government property, interfering with the Selective Service system, and conspiracy to do those things. And then after a while, the state dropped their charges and we were prosecuted by the federal government. And the word evangelization, I mean, that's taken to mean many things. Sometimes it doesn't seem to have much connection with transforming the world, but what is your understanding of that word fundamentally?
Well, you can't preach the gospel of Jesus according to this social justice teaching of the church unless you're doing action for justice. If that's a constitutive dimension in the preaching of the gospel, which evangelization is supposed to be, preaching the gospel. The constitutive dimension is action, working for justice, and working to transform our world. Because Jesus came, and at the beginning of his public life, he proclaimed the reign of God is at hand. It's ready to happen, but followers of Jesus are called to bring it about. And that's what that Synod of 1971 made very clear, that it not only is through prayer and reflection, meditation, so on, it also has to be action, following Jesus and bringing about the transformation of the world.
So that would be good news to the poor, good news, freedom to the oppressed has to be some, represent some kind of possibility of change and some kind of struggle for change.
That's how Jesus started his public life, by proclaiming that he was in the synagogue at Nazareth. His first public proclamation in Luke's gospel was that the reign of God is at hand, and he said, I am here to proclaim good news to the poor, heal the brokenhearted, give the blind new sight, and proclaim God's year of favor. That is the year when the fullness of God's reign will happen. Jesus started his public life with that proclamation, quoting from the words of the prophet Isaiah. And we have to follow the way Jesus leads us.
Our trial was held in the Federal Building in Chicago. Our trial lasted about a month in 1970. We tried to present some of our reasons for the protest action, but the judge basically refused to allow us to present anything about the Vietnam War or the draft. Did you see these actions, the Catonsville 9, the Milwaukee 14, the action I was involved in Chicago 15, as maybe going a little too far or almost going a little too far in terms of destroying property, government property? Some people were somewhat put off by that.
Well, you don't destroy the government property because it's property, but it's property that is maintained for use and used for a purpose that is evil. And so we have to restrain evil at times, and sometimes it requires of destroying the weapons or the mechanisms that bring about the evil. And so that's what would be happening when you disrupt the draft boards and the system that was conscripting young people into the military and sending them off to war.
For some of us, our deepest motivations, while they are profoundly human, flowing from political and social analyses, etc., have an important and explicit religious dimension. He saw that in addition, love involved an attack on the institutions and structures which oppressed his people, the scribes and Pharisees, the religious establishment. In responding to this demand of love, he stood in a direct line with the prophets of old and gave the supreme example to his early followers. For Christians were soon put to the test, ordered to bow before Caesar, to worship the state. It was because of their resistance to such political idolatry, not because of some strictly theoretical or abstract differences of opinion, that they were harassed and persecuted and put to death.
And we were talking before about the just war doctrine, the traditional Catholic and mainline Protestant doctrine, but would you say that our church, the Catholic Church, has moved closer at least to a position of nonviolence, even though it still is not really proclaimed as dogma or doctrine? And
Well,
I don't know, we
it may
come
not
closer
be,
to that.
It may not be in the official teachings of the church, although we're getting closer and closer to making an official teaching, but it's certainly in the scriptures. John Mackenzie, a scripture scholar, in one of his books, proclaimed that if Jesus did not reject violence for any reason whatsoever, we know nothing about Jesus. In other words, he's saying, if you can support violence and say you're following Jesus, you have to be wrong. Because there's no question, when you look at the scriptures, the Old Testament and the New Testament, Jesus rejected violence and called his disciples to follow his way, which is to work for change, not through violence, but through act of love. And so that's built right within the scriptural tradition of the church, and has been proclaimed from the very beginning as part of the teaching of the church. People in the first 3 centuries, if they were being converted, if they were in the military, they would be expected to give up the military life. It was only much later that we began to teach something about how you could justify violence of war. But if that ever was viable as a teaching, it certainly is not with modern warfare, where the consequences of modern warfare are untold numbers of innocent people being destroyed, and the lives of those who do the killing being thrown in upheaval. And then, as Pope St. John Paul said, always leaving behind a trail of hatred and resentment that makes it all more difficult to resolve the very problems that started the war. So you can't build peace through war. It won't happen. It's only through act of love that we can bring about peace that Jesus preached, and the way he lived shows us the way to do it.
I think it is becoming clearer that love and forgiveness and nonviolence have a very important psychological role to play in the process of communication and conscience sensitization in which we are all engaged. At some point in our vigorous and unyielding efforts to raise the issues, confront and challenge consciences, etc., we must show very clearly that we are attacking the roles people play, not the people themselves, who are our brothers and sisters striving for our common humanity. If we don't show this acceptance of persons, this forgiveness, which is of the essence of nonviolence, then people will refuse to face our guilt, and they will viciously suppress the truth and repress those who would remind them of it. Bombarded with the growing evidence of American evil, in the Cali case, for instance, people can go either way, toward recognizing the truth and resolving to change, or toward increasing idolization of America and fascism. It is really a moment of truth and metanoia, and we would do well to follow the approach of Jesus in the Gospels, who somehow accomplished the miracle of loving sinners while loathing the sin. If we try to follow him, then maybe we will have a chance of being forgiven our sins too. May spring and the Spirit bring us all a renewal of love and a rebirth of hope and courage. Peace, resistance, Joe Mulligan. I think it was Pope Paul VI at the UN who made that famous speech, War Never Again.
Our defense budget is so large that it would take the next 10 countries at least. Their total expenditure on war would not exceed our expenditure on war and preparation for war.
Anything you'd like to conclude with about maybe the present times that we're in?
At the present time, yes, we're in great danger again because we have both sides in this situation, in Iran, in the Middle East, and our country facing off against each other with the threat of going to war. We have the same thing with North Korea, and in this case, we would be talking nuclear war, and that evil exceeds anything you can imagine. So we definitely, it's a very timely moment to speak out about the teachings of the Church, especially as Pope Francis is doing, bringing forth and to the attention of Catholics everywhere that Jesus taught us not how to kill, but how to die, loving your enemy. We need that teaching more than ever to avert the destruction of our planet.
In the theology department, several of us will be working on a course in the letters of Paul as soon as the syllabus from Bellarmine arrives. Every Tuesday night we have a scripture service or session which is quite good. This Tuesday we will be starting a rather regular study of Acts using various commentaries. I'm anxious to get into chapters 16 and 19, where the economic dimension of the conflict between Christians and the power structure is quite obvious. Perhaps in the fall, the resistors, who embody in their lives and values and attitudes the elements of the Gospels, might be ready for some heavy stuff in politics and theology. I do think that Christian theology might help them explicitate the principles by which they live.